That is all in on this Wednesday night. The Rachel Maddow Show starts right now. Good evening, Rachel.
Good evening, Chris. I'm glad you played that piece from that J.D. Vance speech. I have been obsessed with that for a very long time, literally declaring the universities are the enemy. It was. I'm not sure that anybody. I'm not sure the population at large grokked the task that he was setting out for the administration at that point.
Yeah, and I think they're going after what is one of the great exceptional things about this country, and there's going to be a lot of damage if they succeed. Yeah.
Yes, they're coming from a very, very radical place, and it is a very valuable thing that they are coming for. Yeah. Thank you, my friend. Much appreciated. And thanks to you at home for joining us this hour. Really happy to have you here. You know what tomorrow is? Tomorrow is Friday Eve, which means you're almost there. You're going to make it. Trust me. Do you know Roz Chast, the cartoonist? Roz Chast does cartoons for the New Yorker magazine, and she has forever. She's been doing that since the 1970s. Roz Chast also wrote a fantastic book that I read a decade ago that has stuck with me ever since. It's written, it's cartoons. It's written in her style and in her art form, which is cartoons, but it's a memoir. It's about her parents aging into their late 90s. And all the crazy decisions or the lack of decisions that made their lives and her life as their daughter such a mess as they got really old. It's this very serious book, but told through cartoons. It's really good. It has stuck with me for a decade. It also has the perfect title, which is, Can't We Talk About Something More Pleasant? Anyway, needless to say, I'm a big Roz Chast fan, and I have been my whole adult life. And one of Roz Chast's cartoons that I keep thinking about all the time in this news environment that we are living in right now is this one. And she has done several cartoons on this theme of Venn diagrams, right? You got two circles and they overlap, and the overlap is usually where the joke is. But in this one, it's a Venn diagram, and on the left, the circle is labeled fun, and on the right, the circle is labeled boring. And in the Venn diagram overlap between fun and boring, that's Bob. Hi, Bob, who is fun and boring. I think about that all the time. The version of this that I keep in my head in this news environment, though there's a slight difference, though. The overlap isn't between boring and fun, as it is in the original. The overlap that I keep in my head is between boring and scary. Boring stories, scary stories. And there's one particular story that lives right in that overlap that I think about every day. It is the story of Donald Trump's return to the presidency that keeps popping up for me right there. It is unrelentingly boring and unrelentingly scary in equal measure. And I have thought about this story every day since it broke. And it is developing now. This is a story out of the federal prosecutor's office, the U.S. Attorney's office in Washington, D.C. If you have been following the news about the rule of law in the Justice Department under Donald Trump, you have noticed that a lot of bizarre stuff has been happening in that prosecutor's office ever since Donald Trump installed a guy there who was at January 6th. And now Trump has named him acting U.S. attorney in Washington, D.C. His name is Ed Martin. And for at least some of the time that Ed Martin has been there, he was attempting to practice law in Washington, D.C. as the acting U.S. attorney for Washington, D.C., despite the fact that he was not a member of the bar in D.C. in good standing. In one case, he wrote to a judge on behalf of the Justice Department, telling the judge to drop the charges against a particular defendant. In so doing, Ed Martin did not mention that he personally was also the defense attorney for that individual defendant. So he's the lawyer on both sides of that case. You can't do that. Ed Martin is the guy who said he wanted to open a criminal investigation into Democratic Senator Chuck Schumer and apparently tried to do so. Ed Martin is the guy who has sent off typo-ridden, bizarre, threatening letters to at least two other Democratic members of Congress, Congressman Robert Garcia and Congressman Eugene Vindman. Ed Martin is the guy who has posted bizarre, like pseudo-legal fan letters to Elon Musk on Twitter, like this one, where he scratched out the typewritten address and wrote in by hand, "Dear Elon." Dear Elon, after your referral, as is my practice, I will begin an inquiry. In case you're wondering, no, that is not how prosecutors' offices are supposed to work. But just catch the flavor here a little bit of this thing. Quote, please let me reiterate again. Reiterate again, really. Please let me reiterate again. If people are discovered to have broken the law or even acted simply unethically, we will investigate them and, all bold letters, we will chase them to the end of the earth to hold them accountable. We will not rest or cease in this. Noon is above the law. Noon. That's actually what he wrote. Noon is above the law. Get me noon. So things have been a little crazy at the top federal prosecutor's office in Washington, D.C. Even separate and apart from them firing all the career prosecutors and all the other things they've done, things have just been a little bit nuts at the top federal prosecutor's office in Washington, D.C. under Donald Trump. Noon! Noon! But when it comes to the overlap of scary and boring, not fun and boring, hi Bob, but scary and boring, when it comes to that particular story out of this office, the thing that has happened at this one prosecutor's office that I think about every day is a story about them freezing a bank account, freezing a bunch of money in a Citibank account. And I know each of those syllables is more boring than the last. It's like impossible to even hold on to it in your head for a moment. Freezing a Citibank account, why do I care? You know, part of the reason you could tell this was a really big deal when it first emerged is because it led to the shock resignation of the top criminal division lawyer in that prosecutor's office. She basically laid out when she resigned what had happened there. And in non-legalese, what it boiled down to is that Ed Martin, the Trump-appointed prosecutor, the guy who was at January 6th, who's now running that office, Martin appears to have ordered her to bring a criminal investigation when she said there was no evidence of a crime. Ed Martin, head prosecutor at that office appointed by Trump, told her to bring a criminal investigation. She said, no, there's no crime. You can't open a criminal investigation without evidence of a crime. He insisted. She resigned. She said publicly why she was resigning, to her credit. Ed Martin then tried to get another prosecutor's office to do it. They refused on the same grounds. Then Ed Martin himself said, okay, I'll do it. He has no background as a prosecutor, which is sometimes obvious in the way he behaves, even in court. In this case, he went to a judge saying, this is my criminal investigation for which I need a warrant to go seize that bank account. The judge said no. The judge said, no, hey, there is no probable cause that any crime has been committed here. No, you cannot have it. Nevertheless, somehow, the FBI and then the Treasury Department were enlisted in this caper, and they leaned on the bank. And the people whose funds were in that bank were denied their funds. They somehow pushed this through anyway. That's how they froze that bank account. And in itself, that sounds boring. But because of the way they did it, this seemingly boring thing is also the opening chapter of a very scary dystopian novel in which the government is seizing your phone records, obtaining all of your text messages and your emails and your iCloud, and maybe raiding your house and raiding your office, and they are taking or freezing the contents of your bank account when there is no probable cause that you have committed a crime. Because what there is a federal prosecutor's office that will do that stuff anyway, even when their own career prosecutors and a judge tell them there's no crime here, you can't do it. So like I said, this is, I recognize this seems like a boring story in terms of all the proper nouns involved here, right? But it is scary in terms of what this means. And I think about this case every day. And now we have had two important developments here. First of all, number one, they are in trouble in court now because of this case. A federal court has just ruled that nothing here seems kosher. Quote, there are serious due process concerns and questions of whether defendants' actions were arbitrary, capricious, an abuse of discretion, otherwise not in accordance with law, contrary to statute, or unsupported by substantial evidence. Quote, there are procedures that must be followed. Quote, defendants vaguely reference multiple ongoing investigations, but offer no specific information about such investigations, factual support for the decision, or an individualized explanation for each plaintiff. This is insufficient. Quote, defendants have not provided the credible evidence required. Quote, vague and unsubstantiated assertions are insufficient. So that's the first thing. This one boring, scary story that I think about every single day is now finally getting turned back by the courts, at least for now. Those funds are being reinstated into that bank account. And whether or not you care about that bank account being restored, whether or not you care about all the, frankly, boring particulars of this case, what is important here is that this one quite bananas prosecutor's office, for the moment, they have been stopped from doing the one thing that they were trying to get away with that really does afford the possibility of Trump just opening the floodgates against Democrats, protesters, journalists, government officials, potentially judges. They have finally been stopped, at least for the moment, from doing something that I think, if they were able to do this, might reasonably result in a lot of people actually fleeing this country in very short order. So they have been held up on that by federal court in Washington. But I said there were two things that have happened on this case. Here's the other thing. I mentioned that there was a big sort of splashy resignation when this all came into the public eye. That prosecutor, the head of the criminal division, the U.S. Attorney's Office in D.C., career prosecutor, very well respected, not at all a partisan, right? Not somebody who they had it out for, who was seen as like some, one of Trump's targets, not a person like that at all. She resigned rather than play a part in this. She resigned rather than, frankly, gin up a criminal prosecution where she said there was no evidence of any crime. When she resigned and explained in a letter what had happened, A, we the public got to see what was happening. Wow, scary. But the other thing that happened is then her job became vacant and they replaced her in that job. There is a new person who is now the head of the criminal division at the U.S. Attorney's Office in D.C. And now we know what the new person who they put in that job has been doing. And surprise, he is apparently doing exactly the kind of thing his predecessor refused to do and resigned over. So we've been covering the story of this little agency, a nonprofit created by Congress during the Reagan era. It's called the U.S. Institute of Peace. They're a small agency. They operate independent of the U.S. government. Their building is not a U.S. government building. They own it and operate it themselves. U.S. Institute of Peace, if you care, their basic remit is to try to stop conflicts around the world from metastasizing into wars. Non-controversial, non-big agency in Washington. Again, essentially an independent nonprofit created by Congress, but they are their own thing. They're outside the U.S. government. On Friday, Trump and his top campaign donor, Elon Musk, sent Musk's people over to the U.S. Institute of Peace, USIP, to go try to shut them down. And the people at USIP refused to let them in. And this is somehow how that went down. This is from the Washington Post, something we've been covering for the last few days. Friday, DOJ agents showed up at the USIP door with two others who said they were FBI agents, but did not further identify themselves. Noting that the building was not the property of the U.S. government, but owned by USIP, a registered nonprofit, and that its personnel were not federal employees, the Institute's officials asked if DOJ had a court order for admission. The DOJ agents acknowledged that they did not have a court order, and on Friday, they withdrew. Then this weekend, Sunday night, the longtime outside legal counsel for the Institute received a call from the head of the criminal division at the D.C. U.S. Attorney's Office, newly appointed Jonathan Hornock. Hornock said his office was investigating suspicions of criminality at USIP. Suspicions of criminality? What? Hornock said Trump's newly appointed supposed directors of the Institute, including Marco Rubio and Pete Hegseth, would like to inspect the books and records of the Institute. Hornock said anyone who obstructs our efforts is subject to criminal investigation, according to one person familiar with the call. And again, no, in case you're wondering, no, this is not how prosecutors' offices are supposed to work, and this is not how prosecutors are supposed to talk. This is not the kind of work that prosecutors are supposed to do or ever do. Not in this country. But they used force of arms to get what they want, threatened criminal prosecution and ultimately guns. According to the Washington Post, a private security company that works at that building was called by Doge and told that they would lose all of their federal contracts as a company if they did not help Doge personnel break into this building. Under that threat, these contractors then did help Doge force their way into the building. They forced their way in and then immediately went to the gun safe inside the building to get weapons. The Washington, D.C. Metropolitan Police were also enlisted to help force Doge into the building, including, reportedly, picking the lock on the office's internal door. Now, the D.C. police, why were they there? They have now said in a statement that the reason they did what they did was, surprise, because they were directed to by Ed Martin. They said they got a call from Ed Martin at the Washington, D.C. U.S. Attorney's Office telling them to do it, and so they did it. So this is this bananas federal prosecutor's office in Washington, the U.S. Attorney's Office in Washington, threatening federal criminal prosecution against private entities who don't do what Doge wants them to do. Doge has no authority over private entities. But Doge said they wanted in there, they wanted to break into that building, and they wanted to get access to everything in that building. So the federal prosecutor's office threatened criminal suspicion, criminal investigation, and criminal prosecution of that private entity for saying no. What did that letter say again? Dear Elon, after your referral, as is my practice, I will begin an inquiry. They are apparently using this part of the U.S. Justice Department as a private police force for the president's top campaign donor, when he is on private property going after a private entity. They are threatening federal criminal investigation and prosecution if you don't comply. And they're threatening to revoke contracts, revoke federal contracts of private armed security if private armed security doesn't join in the armed takeover of these private entities. And again, you may not care about the ins and outs of the U.S. Institute of Peace. You may not care about that one Citibank bank account, right? But what they are doing here is not about the outcomes they are seeking. What they are doing here is all about the power they are trying to exert. They are showing you what they think they have the power to do to you. In court today, the U.S. Institute of Peace was unable to get a restraining order to try to stop the efforts to shut down their nonprofit, their organization. But the judge hearing the case today in Washington expressed astonishment at what has just happened here, saying, quote, this conduct of using law enforcement, threatening criminal investigation, using armed law enforcement from 3 different agencies, probably terrorizing the employees and staff at the Institute, when there are so many lawful ways to accomplish the goals, why? The judge said, quote, why those ways here? The judge just exclaimed in court today, quote, that's a lot of law enforcement at a charitable institution's building. The judge questioned explicitly whether there was a way to accomplish the Trump administration's goals through legal procedures and through Congress, quote, without using the force of guns and threats by Doge against American citizens. So there's a lot going on. There's a lot going on right now. I recognize this is a fast-moving news environment. USA Today is reporting this evening that Trump's going to issue an executive order tomorrow to shut down the U.S. Department of Education, something that roughly 2/3 of the American public is opposed to. Trump's Attorney General, Pam Bondi, went on TV tonight and threatened 3 different federal judges by name. Another federal judge today blocked the Trump administration's efforts to force trans women into men's federal prisons. Another federal judge blocked them from unilaterally killing off money that Congress had appropriated for teacher training. In the insane case where Trump took 3 plane loads of people and shipped them to El Salvador with 0 processing at all, just grabbed them off the street, forced them onto a plane, and shipped them to a prison in another country without any hearing or legal determination at all. Now the Trump administration has been forced to admit that, quote, many of the people they did that to had no criminal record whatsoever. But nevertheless, they're in prison now, indefinitely in a foreign country, and we're not even allowed to know their names. We're not even allowed to know if any of them are, I don't know, U.S. citizens? There's a lot going on, and a lot of it is very hard fought and full of drama. But as much as we are watching all of those stories, those kinds of stories every day, we are also trying to keep our eyes on the sort of shadow stories in the boring corners. Because for now, that is where they are trying to seize truly breathtaking authoritarian power. Not in the future, but right now. And the courts, for now, are kind of, sort of, barely stopping it. For now. I'll stay on it.
Western intelligence agencies believe Russia is behind 2 recent attempts to smuggle explosives onto cargo planes and may be targeting planes bound for the U.S. Tom Costello is with us. Tom, this is quite concerning. What have you learned?
It really is. The explosives went off in DHL cargo hubs in Germany and Britain. Had a bomb exploded while the plane was in the air, the head of German domestic intelligence says the plane would likely have crashed. A Western security official tells NBC News it could be a Russian operation to undermine support for Ukraine, and cargo flights to the U.S. and Canada could be targeted.
Last summer, explosions at DHL cargo hubs. They were not accidents. They were not isolated incidents. They were part of what European and American officials described as an expanding campaign of Russian sabotage, including arson in the UK and the Czech Republic, attacks on pipelines and data cables in the Baltic, and tampering with water supplies in Sweden and Finland. Earlier last year, the U.S. also helped Germany interrupt an alleged Russian plot to assassinate an executive at a German arms manufacturer that supplies arms to the Ukrainian military. But those cargo bombs on those DHL planes, even with all that other stuff, when the DHL planes started having bombs on board, U.S. intelligence officials said they were a Russian test run to figure out how those devices could get aboard planes bound for the U.S. And as such, that was a frightening new escalation for American officials. The idea that that sabotage campaign could be coming here. Months later, the New York Times reported that White House officials became, quote, increasingly alarmed by secretly obtained intelligence suggesting Moscow had a far larger plan in mind to bring the war in Ukraine to American shores. President Biden dispatched his national security advisor and the CIA director to send a series of warnings to Putin's top aides. The core of the warning was that if the sabotage campaign led by Russia created mass casualties in the air or on the ground, the U.S. would hold Russia responsible. They didn't specify what that response would be, but they made it clear they would take the shadow war between Washington and Moscow to new levels. So that was last year. A new in-depth study of Russia's sabotage campaign finds that the number of Russian sabotage attacks in Europe nearly tripled between 2023 and last year, after quadrupling the year before that. Reporting on that, here's how the New York Times put it, quote, anger at Russia's sabotage efforts has the potential to influence European reactions to the U.S.-led push for an end to the war in Ukraine. Prime Minister Donald Tusk of Poland noted in a social media post on Monday that Lithuanian officials had confirmed his assessment that Russia was responsible for a series of fires in shopping centers in Warsaw and Vilnius. Mr. Tusk wrote, quote, good to know before negotiations. Such is the nature of this state. The message to countries supporting Ukraine has been that Russia can impose costs and increase them. So we had this very big scare last year with not just this sabotage campaign rapidly escalating in Europe, but it appearing to start to target the United States. Yesterday, we get data that Russian sabotage attacks in Europe quadrupled one year and then tripled the year after that. Well, now today we get this from Reuters. U.S. suspends some efforts to counter Russian sabotage as Trump moves closer to Putin. Quote, several U.S. national security agencies have halted work on a coordinated effort to counter Russian sabotage, disinformation, and cyber attacks, easing pressure on Moscow as the Trump administration pushes Russia to end its war in Ukraine. The effort involved at least 7 national security agencies working with European allies to disrupt plots targeting Europe and the United States. Since Trump took office, much of the work has come to a standstill. Reuters cites 11 current and former officials here. I'll tell you what Reuters, that Reuters did ask the Kremlin what they think about this reporting. Quote, Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov said the Trump administration was trying to get rid of everything ineffective, corrupt, and implausible. Something he said was, quote, understandable. Joining us now is one of the reporters on that story, Reuters national security correspondent Erin Banco. Ms. Banco, thanks very much for being here and for getting this scoop. I appreciate the chance to talk with you about it.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Is the United States pulling back from anti-Russian sabotage efforts because they don't believe they're happening or because they believe that the efforts are ineffective? What's the rationale on the U.S. side for cutting back on these efforts?
I would say it's very clear from officials we've spoken to, both in this administration and in the prior administration, that our intelligence, U.S. intelligence, European intelligence, still shows that Russia poses a threat both to the U.S. and to Europe. In regard to its hybrid warfare campaign or its sabotage campaign. That threat has not gone away. We've spoken to several very senior intelligence officials about this fact. This intelligence has been circulated as recently as last week here in the US and in Europe. But it's very clear from the conversations we've had over the last month or two that this administration does not view the countering of Russia's hybrid warfare campaign as a priority. This was a very high priority for the prior administration, a program they stood up in 2024 to, across the interagency, track, combat this campaign both in Europe and potentially in the US. And a huge part of that was coordinating with Europe. So that included everything from sharing intelligence, to drawing up strategies for trying to counter Russia's campaign. So it was a massive priority for the Biden administration and something Biden officials briefed Trump officials on right before they left, urging them to continue this program.
The Trump administration is moving to destroy higher education in America. And honestly, it's not an overstatement. It's just a straightforward description of what they're doing. They cut $800 million from Johns Hopkins University, ending healthcare programs globally and in the U.S., research on diseases like cancer and tuberculosis. They're now saying they're going to freeze $175 million in federal funding at the University of Pennsylvania, and cutting $400 million from Columbia University, terminating research projects again on cancer, diabetes, and a whole bunch of stuff. At the same time, they are making unprecedented demands that would basically give the Trump-Musk administration control over how this private university is run. Some schools, like University of Massachusetts Medical School, are already rescinding admission offers to doctoral students in anticipation of coming cuts. Many others, like the entire University of California system, University of Notre Dame, University of Washington, are freezing hiring, afraid they will be hit next. All of this while the administration puts out a target list of over 50 universities across the country they plan on investigating for anti-discrimination practices. Jamil Jaffer is the executive director of the Knight First Amendment Institute at Columbia University. In a recent statement by the Institute, he was quoted saying, "The subjugation of universities to official power is a hallmark of autocracy. No one should be under any illusions about what's going on here." And he joins me now. It's good to have you here.
Great to be here.
Let's talk about this letter written by the Trump administration at Columbia University. Now, I should be clear here that they've cut from all these different universities for all sorts of different reasons. So I think it's fair to surmise that it's the cutting they want to do rather than the reasons they state, right? But in this case, they say you've created an unsafe campus for your Jewish students. There's sort of endemic anti-Semitism. And then they list out this just shocking list of demands. Basically, turn over control of your university to us if you want the money. Can they do that?
The short answer is no. I mean, the letter is totally lawless. Like, they do not have the statutory authority to make these demands. And many of the demands are unconstitutional. Like, there are disagreements at the margins about the breadth of academic freedom, protected by the First Amendment. But a lot of these demands go right to the core of it. So I don't think they have the authority to do it. I also think that you can accuse Columbia of a lot of things, but indifference to anti-Semitism on campus is not one of them. Columbia has actually acted very aggressively to address anti-Semitism. It's still acting aggressively to address anti-Semitism. I don't think that that's what this is really about.
Yeah, I mean, the thought I had was, like, if they can do this, could they just say every research university, the top 50 R1, they're called, right?
Yeah.
They get a lot of federal dollars from grants for research. If you have an African American Studies department, we're cutting off all your federal funding.
I guess so. Yeah. I mean,
is that constitutional? Is that lawful?
No, they have no statutory authority to do it, and it would be unconstitutional. Now, I think many universities are reluctant to push back against these kinds of demands because they see that the Trump administration has many other levers. Now, I should make clear, I don't speak for Columbia, can't speak for Columbia.
No.
I'm not part of those conversations, but I do know that many universities have been confronted with this kind of choice. You know, do we sue, do we push back in some way, or do we try to appease them? And so far, we've seen many universities go that latter route, trying to, appease the Trump administration instead of trying to push back.
We just, in fact, today, the Wall Street Journal reporting that Columbia is nearing agreement to give Trump what he wants, essentially to find some way to work this. But what's so striking to me is, Columbia today, Johns Hopkins, which I don't even really know why Hopkins ended up. What's so crazy is, do people understand that the American university system is literally the envy of the world, and particularly on like science and biomedical research, which is now getting just eviscerated in every direction. I mean, I'm hearing from people, their PhD dissertation canceled, clinical trials canceled. I mean, people doing, how are we going to solve Alzheimer's? Like, it's all being attacked.
I don't think that the Trump administration is trying to solve an anti-Semitism problem on campus. What the Trump administration is trying to do is destroy universities. And it wants to destroy universities with whatever tools it has. And it's destroying universities, I think, for the same reasons it's trying to destroy the media or just trying to destroy the court system. The Trump administration wants to eliminate or neutralize all of the institutions that could be independent sources of authority.
Lest anyone thinks that's like conspiratorial thinking, here's J.D. Vance basically saying that. Take a listen.
So much of what we want to accomplish, so much of what we want to do in this movement in this country, I think are fundamentally dependent on going through a set of very hostile institutions, specifically the universities, which control the knowledge in our society, which control what we call truth and what we call falsity. We have to honestly and aggressively attack the universities in this country.
One of the other places that we're seeing them do this is in the case of Mahmoud Khalil at Columbia, who is a graduate student and lawful permanent resident who is basically just taken. There's political